Hello and welcome to PopFlash, a weekly roundup and discussion of Counter-Strike news. My name is Jack Westerlin and joining me is ESEA caster and former professional player Jason Moses O'Toole. Here's what happened in Counter-Strike this week. Our top story this week is ESL and ESEA's Pro League, which week 3 just finished at the weekend. We're now moving into week 4 this week. But before we do that, let's recap on what we saw in week 3, Moses. So, first of all, Cloud9 continued their kind of dominant streak. They moved 3-1 in the week. They beat Keyed, Stars, LG, Elevate. It really feels like this lineup is coming into their own now. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, starting to get there. The important thing is Freakazoid. His improvement from week to week is something that we're going to keep our eye on throughout the season. He's playing well. He's starting to look good within that team, filling his role very well. Shroud's always, I mean, consistently he's a beast. Nothing's been playing well, and even Skadoodle. I mean, it's Skadoodle. He's going to be on fire. So they're starting to look really, really good so far this season.
And I think it's pertinent to talk also about the Brazilian team, Keyed Stars. So they got off to a great start in the league. They were undefeated for a while, but this week, week 3, I should say, they went 2 for 2 and lost to Liquid and Cloud9. Liquid, of course, was an incredibly close game. Does it feel like we're finding the upper limits of Keyed Stars, the Brazilian roster, at this point?
No, I wouldn't say upper limits, but you're starting to see some of the struggles that they may have. I mean, this move was made so they could get more exposure, more experience playing against talented players that they didn't have in their region. And I think you're going to see a couple stumbles from them like this. One of my biggest concerns about them coming into the season was how deep is their map pool. It's kind of what I wanted to see because we knew they were going to be good on Mirage, and they still are, despite losing to Liquid, which is an impressive win for Liquid on that map. It also Overpass is another map that they're very good on, and it's how deep does their map pool go after that.
Well, it's interesting you should bring up Liquid, actually. So those guys went 4 for 1 in the week.
Yep.
They, in addition to beating Key Stars, they also beat Nihilum, which is Hiko and Semphis's new roster. Talk us through what's going so right for Liquid right now, because those guys have been playing well ever since Gfinity LAN here in London, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what you have to say. Maybe they took something from those losses. I mean, maybe they found something that they really didn't like that they were doing. They've changed it up. Also, the addition of Flowsick, one extra fragger on that team is huge. Especially with Nitro being the player that he is, and he wants to be more of a lurk role instead of an entry frag role that a lot of people see him. And bringing in Flowsick, who can do a little bit more entry fragging, is going to help them out in that regards.
And last 2 North American teams I want to touch upon before we jump over to Europe very briefly. LG and Elevate. LG, a playoff team from last season, both kind of fell down this week. They both went 1 for 2. Again, starting to see holes in those rosters potentially.
I think they'll be fine. I think long term they're going to be okay. I don't see anything really that scary that they're doing wrong or doing super poorly. I think a lot of it with LG is they finalized this move into this house in Toronto with Anger and Pitt. Obviously a big transition for the Swedish player just moving across the world. So that'll stabilize, I think, and especially with the input and all the different players that they've brought in, after last season, they're going to be changing a couple things around, and that's just a natural stumble for them. Elevate. They should have gone 2-0 against Cloud9 on Saturday, up 13-7 on Cobble and letting Cloud9 come back into it, and then beating them on Mirage. But Elevate's a team too. I think both these guys are going to be fine. I think it's just kind of a bad week for them.
And the final story that's kind of worth touching upon this week, jumping over to Europe, as I said, is Ninjas in Pajamas. So they're the opposite to Keyed Stars. They had a terrible start to the league. They were 1 and 4,
Yeah.
and they've since won 5 of their last 6 games, and now stand at 6 and 5. That's kind of a turnaround they had to make at this stage in the league, right, in order to stand a chance for qualifying for these LAN finals.
This was an absolutely huge weekend for him, or week for him, really, because we saw how far. I mean, you said a 1 and 4 to start out with. I mean, that's brutal and that's very tough. That's not where you expect NiP to be at. I think it's good to see because they've been making a lot of changes as well. Even in recent tournaments they've been at, they haven't seemed to have clicked and played to the level they want to play at. So I think bringing in Natu as a coach. They've also Get Right just announced that he's taken over endgame leading for the past couple weeks, and it just got announced today or earlier this week. I think that's just some transitional periods for them as well. They're calling it a learning process they're going through. So trying to change some things around that'll do better for them in the long run. But you can just see them kind of struggle with it in the short term. But it's good to see them perform this well recently.
Story number 2 this week on PopFlash is the announcement of eFrag.net's CSGO World Championship. So, relatively recent announcement this week. They announced a $100,000 prize pool for essentially a national tournament. So teams playing outside of their usual organizations, Team France versus
Right.
Team Spain versus Team USA. Um, there's a lot of international representation. So Africa, Oceania, South America have all got spots at these land finals in addition to North America and Europe. So I guess my first question for you, Moses, is looking at a potential North American roster, who would the standout players, who are the likely candidates for that team going to be?
I think there's two things that you really want to look at, and the first player that comes to mind, who's the only real lock in my opinion in the region, is Skadoodle. I've talked a lot about it, and I'm always going to say it. He's just miles ahead, light years ahead of his nearest competitor in the region when it comes to an opping and in that sniper role. So he's a definite lock. The other big impact I would have on a lineup like this, in my opinion, would be your entry fragging. You want players who are going to be able to open things up for other people to succeed. And for that kind of a role, I'd look at someone, you look at Freakazoid, who's also on Cloud9. You make sure you keep an eye on how much he's improving and how he's playing in that role. I think you also look over to Nihilum, where there's Sanks and there's Automatic. Last ESL breakout for both of those guys, performing very well. They're kind of jack of all trades. They can do entry fragging. They're pretty solid in the mid round. Sanks as well has a great op on the CT side of map. So if Team US ever wanted to run a double op setup, he'd be someone to look at. And then also, if you could convince someone like Nitro, he wants to be in a little bit more of a lurking role with his team, but we've seen the damage he can do as an entry fragger in the past, and if you can convince him for this tournament to play that role, I think he could be very dangerous as long as he's getting back to the level that we've seen him at when he blew up and we said he has so much potential.
Just talking about this tournament overall for a second. So Counter-Strike has this long history of staging these international tournaments where teams do play for their national teams. It goes right back to CS 1.6, Source, and now in CS:GO they're recreating it again. The most recent example of this was eFrag's European Championship back in December last year, but that kind of felt like we weren't seeing the strongest team for a lot of countries like Sweden,
Right.
Poland. It didn't really feel like they were putting their best foot forward. Do players actually care about representing their national team, or is it just a side project, a bit of fun and games on top of their usual gig?
They definitely care, and there's definitely going to be pride in your region. Every player has pride in their region. I think the big thing that you really saw was, you look at the schedule that the European competitors have, the European teams and players, they have so many events to go to, they have so many leagues to play in, and it's a grind. And I think at certain points people get a little bit burnt out. We see it in Fnatic with Pronex being like, I'm just a little bit burnt out from calling, give me a break. So things of that nature, I think players are going to use this as a time to take a break. And if they don't want to go just so because they wanted to have a weekend off of Counter-Strike, I mean, that's kind of something you can't really argue with.
Finally, before we wrap up this episode of PopFlash, a few quick community news stories to go through. So, first of all, Moses, Team Penta have announced the brand new signing of a 9-month contract with a new roster and the acquisition of a gaming house. Talk us through what these guys are up to.
Well, there's a lot of talent on that team, and they've shown a lot of potential in the past with some great performances. And really, to me, this just gives them an opportunity to become a team that has potential and to a team that can do some damage night in and night out. And hopefully, we see that.
Another story that's worth picking up, especially for North American viewers, is the fact that Jordan Nothing Gilbert was featured on Joe Rogan's podcast. So
Yeah.
I guess straight off the bat, you've got to say that's pretty good exposure for esports and Counter-Strike as a whole, right?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to watch and listen to, and it was really cool listening to Joe get walked through the world of esports that he had no knowledge about. There's really no, in my opinion, there's no real player that you could have picked except for Jordan to have been in that situation, and he handled it very well, and it was really cool to watch. So if you guys haven't seen that, I'd definitely check it out.
And last story in our community news section this week is the fact that Property have just dropped their roster. Moses, once again, can you give us a kind of rundown as to what those guys are going through right now?
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see where they all go. I mean, it's another case where, I mean, it's just a Swedish team, and with NiP and Fnatic, I mean, there's so many talented players in that region. The real interesting thing to me from it is now that they're all free agents, we've seen players from Sweden like Pitt, like Maxaki, come over here to the States to play on teams, Luminosity and Ace Gaming, obviously. So it's really interesting that these guys, if that's going to become a trend, if we're going to see some Europeans who have a tough time breaking into the professional scene over there, come over to North America where they could do some damage on one of these teams and try and make it professional here in the States.
So what you're saying is there are just so many good European Counter-Strike players that we can't physically all fit inside Europe, and we're traveling elsewhere to join
Yeah,
Counter-Strike teams around the world.
bring us your Swedish stars. We'll take them in here in North America. We welcome everybody.
All right, fair enough. That's it for this week. My name's Jack Westerman, joined by Jason Moses O'Toole.
And we'll be back next Wednesday for another episode of PopFlash.